Welcome to Standard 4C. The goal of this presentation is to explain migration, settlement patterns, cultural diffusion, and social classes in colonized areas during the Age of Exploration. It's a lot to get through in a 15-minute video. Hopefully we can make it. By migration, we're looking at the movement of people and things from one place to another. And by cultural diffusion, we mean the spread of various cultural things like religion, music, technology, fashion, food, from one culture or group to another culture or group. So we'll head back in time and take a look at our essential question, which is, what were the effects of European migration and settlement on the Americas, on Africa, and on Asia? We can think of these Europeans arriving in these places like a new student arriving in class after the school year began. The arrival of that new student might cause some students to have to move seats. Some students might get along very well with the new student. Some students perhaps might not get along as well. But the arrival of that student in class is going to have some effects. The essential understanding to help us answer that question, we want to have an understanding that Europeans, when they migrated to these colonies in the Americas, their arrival created new cultural and social patterns. We can see here in this picture, this painting, we have a European and a Native American interacting. We see the difference in clothing. We can imagine the differences in language and religion, in technology. That interaction, though, is going to result in new cultural and social patterns for both groups involved. Okay, the essential knowledge, what do we want to get out of this presentation? First was the overseas expansion of territorial claims by European countries. In other words, the European countries are going to claim territory. Territorial here referring to an area of land or a specific territory. Keep in mind, European countries tend to be relatively small. Most European countries are about the size of American states in terms of land size. So the Age of Exploration gave these countries an opportunity to claim huge areas of land in the Western Hemisphere, and along with the land came the various resources that those lands had. We see by color here all the different European countries that had land claims in the Western Hemisphere. It's really four of them, though: Spain, Portugal, England, and France, who have the biggest lasting legacy on the Americas. Another piece of essential knowledge is we see the emigration of Europeans to the Americas. By emigration, we mean leaving your country to go live in another country. People who emigrate from one country are immigrants with an eye to the country that they arrive in. In this picture here, we see the Pilgrims arriving in Plymouth in Massachusetts from England. They were emigrants from England, immigrants to the Plymouth colony, and we start to see large numbers of people leave Europe, whether it was to escape hunger, religious persecution, war. We see large numbers of Europeans leaving Europe to come settle in the Americas. This map here shows us the 13 colonies along the east coast of the present-day United States, and in 1755 we can see the diverse mix of European countries represented. Even in the 13 English colonies, we had a large representation from Holland, from Germany, from Scotland and Ireland, different groups besides just England. An important thing to keep in mind as well is these colonists, when they arrived, they really could have, if they wanted to, they could have left their culture behind. They could have said, well, we're leaving England, we're leaving France, we're leaving Spain. We're going to leave what made us English, French, or Spanish behind and jump into whatever new culture we find here in the Americas. Instead, the colonies imitated. They acted like or behaved the same way as the culture and social patterns in their mother country. The mother countries, again, being the countries that they left. Okay, so England, France, Spain, Portugal. In the picture, we see the little girl imitating the clothing of the mother. Maybe she imitates the way the mother talks, or she likes the same food that the mother likes. Same thing with the colonies. They tended to stay very much the same as they were back in Europe. We can think of this, if we look at the different color-coded areas and think of them as being kids in a family. We can look at this family here, and we can see that mom and dad are football fans, and in particular Pittsburgh Steelers fans. Sports, whether it's an interest in sports or rooting for a particular team, is often passed down in a family. It would be highly unlikely that two parents who were die-hard Steelers fans would have kids who were really strong Baltimore Ravens fans. Okay, parents influence things like who their kids root for or what sports they like. Likewise, religion. If we know that these parents are Muslim, we wouldn't expect that the child that they're raising would be raised Buddhist. In other words, religion is something that's typically passed down from the parents to the kid. Another example would be politics. Politics is something often shaped by the parents and then adopted by the children. In this case, if we know that President and Mrs. Obama are strong Democrats, we really wouldn't expect Sasha and Malia, their daughters, to grow up to be strong Republicans. We can apply this same thing to the colonies. The areas that the English settled, they were largely English-speaking and Protestant. The areas that Spain settled were largely Spanish-speaking and Catholic. Okay, another important point here is we're going to see the demise of the indigenous societies. The Aztecs, Incas, and other indigenous groups are largely going to end. Okay, the demise is the end or the death of a person or thing. And these groups are largely wiped out due to smallpox. Indigenous is a person or thing that's original or native to an area. So the native groups, the Aztecs, the Incas, the other Native American groups, were indigenous to this side of the world. The English, French, Spanish, Portuguese were not indigenous. Smallpox was a horrible disease. It was one of the largest killers ever in world history. Had a very high mortality rate, and the native peoples, the indigenous peoples, were very susceptible to it. Europeans, Africans, Asians, they had kind of been exposed and built up immunity to it. The Native Americans had never seen it before, and it really just ripped through their societies. We see it here in this graph showing the population of Native Americans in central Mexico. In 1520, there were over 25 million Native Americans in central Mexico, and by the year 1600, 80 years later, that number had gone all the way down to 1 million. It's an absolutely massive decline in population, okay, over 95% in less than a century. And historians attribute most of that to disease. Yes, some Native Americans are killed by swords and guns brought over by Europeans, but the largest percentage is wiped out due to disease. And the disease we want to focus and keep in mind is smallpox. The Native Americans were the original slave group here in the Western Hemisphere. The Europeans, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese, put the Native Americans to work fairly soon after their arrival. However, their large decline in just 100 years caused these European groups to look for a new labor source. And that's where we start to see the forced migration of enslaved Africans to do work in the Americas. Okay, to enslave is to make somebody, force somebody to be a slave. This was a horrendously brutal practice. We'll talk more about this in Standard 4D, but we see here the capture of entire families, literally kidnapping, the transportation in absolutely horrendous and unsanitary, cramped, crowded conditions across the Atlantic Ocean. And we see on this map here the destination of enslaved Africans. Most people taken as slaves, most people enslaved in Africa came from this area, this western area in Africa. They were there, then boarded on the ships, and as we can see by our numbers here, the largest percentage are sent to the islands of the Caribbean. Places like Jamaica, Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Haiti, those islands down the Caribbean is where the largest percentages of slaves were sent. Another piece of essential knowledge is a legacy of a rigid class system and dictatorial rule in Latin America. A legacy is a long-term lasting effect. Something that's rigid is not able to bend, change, or adapt very easily. And dictatorial is something that is a system or style of ruling that's not democratic. It's the way a dictator would rule. Okay, especially in Latin America, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies had this very strict social pyramid. Okay, and these are the groups that were in the pyramid, and it was all based on race. At the top of the pyramid were the peninsulares, and just the word itself sounds like peninsula. It refers to the Iberian Peninsula back in Europe, where Spain and Portugal are located. People from Spain and Portugal were immediately at the top of the social pyramid. If you were born in Europe, you were at the top of the pyramid. So rigid was the system that their own children who were born here were a level below them. They were the Creoles. In fact, some Peninsulares mothers who shortly after finding out they were pregnant, tried to sail back to Europe so that their children would be born in Europe, and therefore Peninsulares and not Creoles. Okay, we had two mixed groups. As the groups start to mix together in the Americas, we have the offspring of a Native American mother in this painting and a European father. That was a group called mestizos. We had another group, or another offspring here, of a European father and an African mother, who would be known as a mulatto. These two mixed groups were a level below the Creoles, the European children. Okay, and then the two groups who did most of the work, Africans and Native Americans, had the least rights and the least privileges in this system. Okay, by dictatorial rule, we kind of have a legacy in these areas of rulers like Fidel Castro in Cuba, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, Manuel Noriega in Panama, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, rulers who are dictators. And that's largely a historical legacy of Spanish and Portuguese rule in these areas. Okay, coming up close to the end of our time here, our last bit of essential understanding is Europeans were also in Africa and Asia, but they didn't have the same impact. They didn't bring the culture, the language, the religion to the same degree. We'll see some of that later on in the course when we get to the age of imperialism. But right now the Europeans are just establishing trading posts. Okay, they set up trade posts, economic outposts here for trade along the coast of Africa. Products like slaves, gold, and other natural resources are traded at these places. Okay, as we can see, a lot of these dots here representing trade posts. In Asia, we see in India, China, and the islands of the Indies colonized by merchants, business people. Okay, we see here on the map, again, trade posts set up by merchants. And The Portuguese, English, and Dutch, they established trading companies. They set up businesses to do trade with Asia. These included the Dutch East India Company, which made a lot of people back in Holland very wealthy, and the British East India